So here we are back with part 3. I'm just working on the details using the Createx Illustration Paynes Grey still. It's the same colour. This took quite a while, so I've done this in maybe 3 or 4 different parts. So at the moment I'm just working on the medallion, which is quite finicky, so I am using the sharpened end of the paintbrush to bring in the detail back. So obviously there's a little bit of overspray. I'm just cleaning it up with the sharpened end of the paintbrush. Bits like this, it's important to make sure the airbrush is running nice and smooth, because you don't want any blotches or paint splatters at that point. Easy to clean up if it does happen, but if you can avoid it, it's preferable. So in this video also I tackle the chainmail, which it was quite a it was an interesting process. I really didn't know how to go about it first to start with. I thought the best idea would be to map it out with overlaying the original drawing over top, and using graphite on the back of that to actually redraw so using it as like a transfer method. So graphite on the back of the original artwork, press it on there, draw over top of the actual chainmail, which then transfers the graphite, which is lead pencil, onto the Yupo paper. But the problem is, because it was so finicky, it was hard to get proper detail, so hard to get anything to follow really. As you can see, I'm sort of just trying to find whatever I can to use, which there was no real decent pattern to it, but that's okay. It was the first idea I had, so I went with that. I do work out a better way of doing it, and again I apologise for being out of focus. After editing this video, I will let you know that there's quite a bit of this footage that's out of focus, but I still used it because otherwise I would have lost it all. I've edited the subsequent 2 videos after this, and I must say they look a lot better. So there's not a lot of out of focus stuff on the next 2 videos, so I do kind of work it out a little bit better after this. So I apologise for this video, but it is what it is at the moment, and you can kind of see what I'm doing. So yeah, this was the idea, to scratch back in the detail, but because I had no real no decent pattern laid out, it was really hard to give me something to follow. So this chainmail I wasn't overly happy with the end result, but it's I did learn a bit from it, so that was good. I probably could come back in and fix this afterwards, but the whole project took me so long that it was pretty much I didn't want to go back in, tamper with it, because anything could happen. Just from a distance it looks okay. It's pretty tedious. You can see this is sped up quite a bit, 8 times actually. I think I said in the last video it was sped up about 5 times, but I must have got it wrong. So yeah, it was all just about trying to block in the darkest bits and then bring in the highlights around it, but it didn't really work. So there's you'll see me doing a lot of back and forth in this video. Unnecessary back and forth, but I guess if I learn something out of it, nothing's unnecessary really. So I use the eraser there, the pencil eraser. So that was just gives you a softer edge, rather than scratching in really sharp edges like that, right there. The pencil eraser just gives you a softer edge, but the problem is once it's once you've used it for a little while, it blunts a little bit, so you can't actually get a, yeah, it's really hard to get an edge on it at all. Get a decent line anyway, I should say. I've sped this up quite a bit because obviously it's pretty boring. But you can see there I've literally just kind of undone my work of having all the darkest, the negative spaces, the darkest points, scratched it back again, and basically going back in and back and forth with this technique. It's really time consuming. It paid off. I mean, after a while of back and forth, it did actually start to look half decent. As you can see, there was a shadow across there, which I would suspect is from his hand, which all that blank space on the right is his hand. So this shadow, I'm using a toothpick, because a toothpick gives you it's a very fine edge, so it gives you some sharper detail. Because I noticed on the reference picture that the highlights on the chainmail in that area is very minimal. There's only a tiny little bit of light reflecting off the very tops of it, the tops of the curve. So I've probably gone a little bit too much with that. Well, that's okay. I go back and forth. I can go back over this with the Paynes Grey and knock it back again, then come back in and scratch it out again. It's not wrecking the paper. The Yupo paper holds up pretty well. Now go back in with that drop shadow. That kind of works. You can see the highlights brought it. Scratching those highlights in has brought it back out again, even though I'm adding that drop shadow. And my electric eraser, I'm just using that to clean up the edges of his hand so that I've got a nice surface. So there we go. That's the tools I used. So you've got the Perfection 10, I think they're 1056 pencils. They're really hard, quite good. And the electric eraser, I love that electric eraser. It's got two different size heads on it. And then of course the paintbrush that was at the bottom, it's got the sharpened end. So I find all those three tools very, very useful in this sort of project. Obviously, being on Yupo paper, you can use those quite effectively, but you know, it's hard to transition those across to, say, a helmet or a motorcycle tank or anything, you know, metal substrates. You can, but you've got to be very careful not to scratch, because otherwise, you know, end up scratching a customer's job. But you know, with this sort of thing, this is, you know, considered fine art, I guess. So it's not really an issue. But if I wasn't able to scratch, use the scratching technique or the erasing technique, I'd probably bring in my detail with white, so which would give me a softer sort of an image, but it would still work. Here I am trying to just darken those negative spaces up a bit more, which really brings the chainmail out, drops the background further back, brings the foreground, which is the chainmail, out to the eye. It's basically an on-off action with the trigger again, like I mentioned in a previous video. A lot of just on-off, moving around the place, not sticking in the one spot. There, you can see there, I realised that the highlights are prominent more on the top edges of the curve, so it's that sort of brings it out and makes it look a little bit more effective. But you're getting close and it looks looks like garbage. But I guess the optimal viewing distance is probably, you know, a foot away or somewhere around that area. Just dusting off my paintbrush. But again, out of focus. It's a bit disappointed with that, because I really wanted to show how I did the leather effect, because obviously all this stomach, the breastplate and the stomach is all like a leathery sort of material, which again is a lot of texture, so it's a lot of on-off with the trigger, and basically just it's almost like a shaking method. So if you've got really shaky hands, you could actually pull off a good leather effect, really. So it's all about just trying to keep the airbrush moving. Don't stop in the one spot, just keep it moving, and fairly light on the trigger so that you don't pump out too much paint, because otherwise you don't want harsh lines coming out. Otherwise it's just going to be too bold. It's all about building up very slowly. You can see that's, there's not a lot of paint coming out. It's a very slow process, but it's all part of the fun. And the good thing is about building it up slow is if you've got plenty of room for mistakes. So if you look at it and it's not quite right, you know that you've still got a few shades darker to go. You've actually got room to play. You can actually fix up any issues within those few shades, and you'll find that when you finally got it to the tone you want, the shade that you want, you've brought it into, it's hard to explain, but you've you've ironed out those mistakes, little things like that. See, I just scratched off I don't even know what that was. I think it was just a foreign object just stuck to the page, but because I was working light, I still had room to cover that. The other thing with working, I had to work slow as well, building up these shades, because my Paynes Grey is still very over reduced, and if you try and build up too quickly, you're going to end up with spider webs. The paint's going to be wet. It's going to be a disaster. So it's all about just slow build up. When I want to do some nice hard drop shadows, I'll add some more paint to my mix. So I'll thicken the paint up, and I'm pretty sure I do that coming up soon underneath the belts. They've got some nice hard shadows, but for now it's just basically working in the details, well, not the details but the form, just trying to find where the lines are, and it's kind of like drawing them in, rough drawing them in with the airbrush. And slowly darken. See, I come back in here, I'm going back over my texture that I created in the very first run, and that texture will actually shine or come through from underneath the second coat. And I'll go over and do another probably 2 or 3 coats over that. Slowly darkening it up. There we go. So you just, even though it's out of focus, you sort of see what's going on there. Slowly darkening it up. The reference that I was working from was very dark, so, but the problem was I was actually looking at the reference. The reference I was using was actually on a tablet, but then you look at it when it's printed out, it's a different tone. When you look at it on a computer, it's a different tone. So it turned out the reference that I was looking at on my tablet was very dark, so I was almost tempted to go really dark with this, but luckily I'd seen it on another computer. I'd seen a printout and thought, it's probably not as dark as it actually looks in the actual reference on the tablet, so I kept it a bit lighter, and it actually turned out better than what it would have been if I went really dark with it. And the good thing about that is if you get to the end of it and you look at it and go, no, it's still a bit too light, you can actually darken it up. It's really hard to come back the opposite way. If something's too dark, it's it's much harder to bring it, to lighten it up. And if you're using your whites over top of that, you're going to get the blue shift, it's called, which is when you use a lighter colour over a dark colour, gives a blue shift. Which there is ways of reducing that, but I might add a bit of orange to my white mix, but you know, it still does come through, especially when you're using a blue undertone like I'm using. The Paynes Grey it does have a blue tint to it. See that I'm using, I like to use ripped paper for freehand shields, because you can cut them into any shape you need. So, you know, with the belts I've got there, some of them have a really subtle curve on them. So some of the freehand shields that I've got haven't, you know, got a really sharp curve on them, and so I just cut out a bit of paper to match what I'm about to lay down. The other thing is I can't remember if I mentioned this in the previous video, but using the Mylar stencils on Yuko paper can scratch it. So, and I think I did mention that in the last video, but doesn't hurt to mention that again. Might save somebody from screwing up their piece if they missed it in the first video, because yeah, it is very easy to scratch. Try not to put too much Paynes Grey into the belt, because there is I will be introducing some colours into this part of the belt, especially on the left hand side of that medallion. I noticed in the reference there's some what looks to be some sepias, some violets. I think what I end up using is a burnt umber. I use a lot of burnt umber in that, because it's obviously leather. You've got to give the you know, well, basically make it look like leather, so the colours that leather would be like a brownish tone. So the burnt umber worked well, especially, and the sepia, because sepia as well, you can make it if you keep spraying over top of, continually doing if you keep spraying sepia on top of each other, it'll actually come out black. So what I'm trying to say is layering sepia is actually a better black than actual black, because black can come out quite flat. So I often use my sepia as a black tone, and especially using it over top of Paynes Grey, sepia can appear to be very, very black. So I didn't actually have to use any black in this piece at all that I can recall. Maybe, you know, a bit here and there, but it's not really prominent, because I've had some failures with black. I had a tank that I done when I first started that I painted all blue, and I thought it looked alright, which for one of my first pieces it was okay. I look back at it now, it wasn't that flash, but what really killed it was I used black in it for, I think it was some drop shadows and maybe the eyes, I can't remember, but anyway, when it was clear coated, the black really stood out because it just flattened, and it looked awful. So did learn a good lesson there. So black's not always needed. See, I've stuck a piece of paper down just below the belt there. That's just to obviously stop me from smudging when I'm using the erasers and the sharpened end of the paintbrush. If you smudge your work, you've got to try and cover it or erase it before you do it, before you go over it. And again, just scratching in some threads into the belt there, like I did in the second video. Very finicky work, trying to darken around those threads, but you can always redraw them in, doesn't matter. It didn't come out too bad. There you go. See, I've using the cut paper just to drop those shadows in a bit more. So I've still got a long way to go to darken that bottom corner up there. So just for the time being, keeping a light building up all around it, so I know how dark I have to go. It's much easier to tell how dark you need to go when you've painted the rest of the area in as well. So you've got something to use for contrast. You notice sometimes I come in and I just all of a sudden I'm working with really dark tones in what you can't see because the video's been sped up. What you miss is me basically adding paint to the mix. So I pretty much cut it out because obviously I waste a few minutes trying to get that right. So I cut that out of the video, but every now and then you'll see me painting a light tone, then all of a sudden it'll be very dark. So that's where I've added more paint to the mix. You can see it's starting to look a bit more like leather now that it's getting darker. Scratching in some hair. So that part I just painted then was part of the severed heads that he's holding, which that'll be, I think that's the next video where I start on the heads. Actually it may be the one after the next one, because I've still got to do the bottom part of his suit and his arm. That was me testing the. I think I finally worked out there that everything was out of focus. So hopefully from now on I think it's a little bit better. I think you've seen me do that a few times. Just making sure everything's working. Finally worked out how to lock the focus on. I think at this point was where it clicked with me how to do the chainmail. I thought it's much easier to lay down a very, very light mix to just to give me something to work over, and then just scratch all my detail into it. It's basically like drawing. So you lay down the Paynes Grey, scratch the detail of the chainmail in over top of that, and then you can work around it with the airbrush, and that gives you a nice soft, some nice soft detail, rather than the very sharp chainmail which I sort of had on the top left shoulder. Obviously this part of him would be a little bit more out of focus as well because it's further away. But I was actually quite happy with the way his arm turned out. I think that was probably one of the better parts of his armour, his suit. And I guess it was probably because it was just a bit more subtle than the main front part. Another one of my custom bits of paper. I've got my lines drawn out there, and I like to erase them a little bit to the point where you can barely see them. Just means you don't have to cover them as much. It's just a cleaner surface to work on, and I find that sometimes the graphite can actually dirty up the paint a little bit, so the cleaner I can get it, the better. The less work I have to do to try and clean it up. More stitching, more leather effect. So I've explained a little bit of that to you. Same process, just working slowly, building up lightly. No rush, unless it's, you know, unless it's a paid job for a customer, which this wasn't. This I did this for my own pleasure, really. It was probably one of my most ambitious projects. Yep, my hand's in the way. Sorry about that. Promise you, I do plan on getting better at this video recording business. It's definitely not one of my strong points. And I am using my phone to record this, so it's been a struggle to get good enough video to actually use. Trying to get as close as possible to get so you can see what I'm doing, but also try not to get in the way. So, which is sometimes hard because you know, you want to come in from different angles to so that your overspray is directed in a different way. It's part of the technique. So sometimes the camera gets in the way and I'm trying to work around it, and then sometimes my hand gets in the way of the camera. But it does appear that I've worked out the focus a little bit more now. It's not dropping out as much. See, I'm going back and forth between the chest and the arm. I just don't want to work on the one spot for too long, as you end up you don't get a consistency. Basically, it's you want to try and keep everything uniform. If you work on the one spot for too long, you might find that it looks a bit different. It just keeps it more interesting as well, because you kind of get sick of working in the one spot. So this is the technique I was discussing before, how I spray a very light mix and then redraw the chainmail back in over top of it, and I think it worked much better. So it looks quite harsh there, but as you can see, coming back in with the airbrush, I'm just knocking all that back. And there, obviously I made a mistake, went over a piece of chainmail, but it's fine. You can knock it back again, take out the take off the paint with the scratching technique. The paper allows for a lot of room for error, which is great. The only problem with this UPO paper is scratching hair and things like that. It's not the greatest because the paint dries on it and it doesn't scratch very well. You've really got a short window of time to scratch with this sort of paper, unfortunately. And if you don't utilize that time, then you're not really going to get a good scratching technique, especially for hair, something as fine as hair. So I find quite often I have to paint the hair with the airbrush, which not too much of an issue. It actually, for me, it gives it a nice softer sort of a hair rather than a little harsh, harsh detail, which some pictures have a call for that though. Some pictures do need the real sharp detailed hair. This wasn't one of them, so I was quite lucky. I'm just bringing those highlights back in, just trying to be minimal with the highlights. Less is more, like they say. More threads, bringing them back in. It's a lot of back and forth. People ask me, how do I have the patience to do this? Don't really know how to answer that, really, because I like doing it. What else would I be doing, really? So here I noticed that I'd actually missed a bit when I had placed my reference down. That's obviously the finger that comes across the sword, the hilt of the sword, and I'd actually cut it off, so I'm basically working that back in. There we are. So what I'd done for that was dip the end of the sharpened end of the paintbrush into the reducer, just to wet the paint in that area, and then rub it off. Quite easy. Like I said, this Yupo paper is quite forgiving. So here I'm working in the shadows, while at the same time I'm working in the texture for the leather, just so I know where I'm at. You've got the edge of the thumb there, which is casting a shadow. I want to make sure I lay down that shadow so I know where my texture needs to be, and slowly build around that. Obviously the sword needs a slightly different technique, because the sword doesn't have texture in it, as much texture in it as the leather does, so you kind of got to be a bit smoother with the airbrush on this part. So rather than the on-off technique that I use for the leather, you've kind of got to be more consistent with your paint, just nice strokes, and very, very light passes to build it up. So you want a nice smooth transition in your tones. Just bringing some texture back in with the eraser. A little bit harsh, but because I've worked so light, I've actually got room to soften that back up again. That's the beauty about working very slowly and working with a reduced mix. It actually gives you a lot of leeway when you make mistakes, which I make a lot of mistakes, but make mistakes actually it helps me learn so much quicker. So I don't, unless it's a massive mistake, I don't really mind too much. Had some doozies that made me tearing my hair out. But this piece I didn't really have a lot of problems with, I must say. The good thing is, with a piece this detailed, any mistakes you can kind of hide as well. I'm just sharpening my edges up with the paintbrush. You see how useful the paper is as a freehand shield. Very, very useful. And even there, I'd just taken that little bit of a bump in that sword there that I've just taken out. A bit of Paynes Grey and the freehand shield. The cut paper came in very handy when I was doing the sword, because there's a lot of straight edges. I was actually really happy with the end result of the hand. It looked quite effective. The leather look turned out quite well, I think. The sword, that was a different story. I was struggling to get that looking authentic. There's a lot of back and forth with that. I probably should have used freehand shields a bit more on the sword, but I did eventually get it. You can see there, I didn't line that up real well. That probably should have been, that middle bit should have been a bit wider. That's just laziness on my behalf, really. And that line across the blade that I'm doing right there needed to be much straighter. So I don't know about anybody else, but to do a straight line, I find the best way for me to do a very straight line with the airbrush freehand is straight up and down. If I go side to side, I can't get as straight a line as if I'm going straight up and down. So what I probably should have done there is tilt the whole painting, 20 odd degrees to the left, so that blade is almost 90 degrees, and I can just create a line going straight up and down using the muscle memory, which I did eventually do actually towards the end of the piece, because I left the blade till fairly late, because I was holding off because I was a little bit nervous about that. I thought I'll do all the easier parts, like the textures and things, because you can hide a lot of your mistakes in these sort of areas. It's starting to give this hand some depth. Getting the introducing the real darkest areas. These are all shadows from branches.